Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you could join us today for an excellent session. We've got some fantastic panelists talking about virtual interviews, which of course have become a part of our life over the last year because of COVID. A lot of the sessions out there have been about virtual interviews focused on the person who's being interviewed and how they should interact in regards to their interview and how the paradigm has shifted for them. But there's actually been nothing, at least to our knowledge, out there about what the institutions should be doing and how they should potentially handle these virtual interviews, given that they're coming up and that, of course, there have been other glitches with technology that we've seen in other realms that have used technology in order to get their interviews or their discussions across. The business world and a lot of the other kind of groups that have had to go virtual have people working from home, and so they've had kind of a seamless transition. But in medicine, as always, we've had a little bit of a hiccup because we've been doing things one way forever. So this session is really dedicated to institutions and how we can do the best for the people that we're interviewing and get the best at our interviews so that we can get people to join us and really showcase what we have at our institutions through this new virtual paradigm. So I'm going to start by just giving you a 5-minute talk about what we're doing here and the importance of virtual interviews. I'm sharing my screen with you now. And then I'll introduce our very esteemed group of panelists this evening. So the importance of the virtual interview in and of itself just sounds, of course it's important. It's an interview and you need to have interviews in order to match and in order to go on to residency and fellowship. But why is it really important? What's the nitty-gritty behind it? Well, first of all, the most important thing here is that this is the first year. And when you have a first year, you have to adapt. You have to improvise and you have to overcome challenges because you have to do it. So in this picture, clearly, he had to cover his face because masks are mandatory. And this guy took it upon himself to adapt. And that's what this session is all about. How are you going to adapt as an institution going from kind of the old school way of doing things to the new school way? It's easy to say, hard to do. Now, I want you to be in the mindset that this is actually a very good thing. Again, as I mentioned earlier, with the business world, this has been done before. And they've shown, there's studies out there, not in medicine, but in the business industry, that in fact, virtual interviews come with a faster process with enormous efficiency because you can control the timing. They're very cost effective, and that's just obvious to all of us. People don't have to travel to these interview dates, and they don't have to take time off from work, losing valuable hours on the other end. Obviously, this will have a much greater reach. Somebody could do their virtual interview from the other side of the globe. And as we all know, as attendings, when we do these interviews, people get sent off to cases, people are on call. Sometimes we do a great 30 minutes with one interviewee and then we're missing for the next interview. So it eliminates all of these issues. And it allows candidates to see all the different interview groups because they don't necessarily have to interview on the same day. And finally, it does add an element of transparency and smarter selection because of standardization. Everybody will have a certain amount of time, everybody will have to match that time, and every interviewee will be asked most likely a certain set of questions. And that really helps to take away some of the implicit bias that may come with the interview process. Now, of course, that's the good. What's the bad? Well, here's the bad. You don't get to go to the hospital. So there are no hospital tours. We don't get to wow our candidates with the frills that we do sometimes, introducing them to amazing people they may have read in textbooks. We can't introduce them to our staff. This is our great admin. This is the person who runs the residency face-to-face. Of course, we don't have physical sub-internships anymore, but that's also gone virtual. So we've lost the ability to have that one-on-one long-term interaction. We don't have any pre-interview events where a lot of us make decisions when we watch candidates interact with each other and ourselves. And as I've told my panelists before, very important to me was the interview day lunch, which is gone. And so that's another element that we're not going to be able to share with our group. So what that means is that the people that we are now going to be interviewing are going to be judging us on the little interview that we do all virtual. So if you can't get something to work, they might potentially see that as a way in which your program runs. I mean, technically, like from a technology standpoint. So we have to focus on the things that make our group shine. And so it's important through this panel to find out what those things are so we can really ensure that things are seamless on the day of the interview. And as we all know with surgery, you measure twice, you cut once, same thing. We should do this because this may be the way of the future. So let's do it once, let's do it right. And if we do it right this first time, we put the time into it, then moving forward, we should have seamless interviews if we in fact make this the new norm. Now I want to introduce our very esteemed panel. We've got just some fantastic speakers today. We really put time and effort into picking people that are perfect for these talks. So to start with, we have the do's and don'ts of virtual interviews by our program director at Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Conrad. After that, we're going to have Dr. Simons, who's the program director at UMass, talking about the various recruitment efforts during the pandemic. Next, we have Dr. Aurora, who's also a program director at the Medical College of Georgia, on how to interview for equity and diversity through this new paradigm shift. And finally, we have Dr. Martin, who's going to be talking about how to write an equitable letter of recommendation. And he's perfect for this talk, being the Associate Vice Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first very esteemed panelist, Dr. Conrad, talking about the do's and don'ts of virtual interviews. I'm going to stop sharing. And Dr. Conrad, please go ahead and share your screen.
All right. So I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I'm going to talk about the do's and don'ts of virtual interviews, which is really the question, can virtual interviews be meaningful and personal? That's what we really need to try to figure out. I am a vascular surgeon at MGH, and so we do two types of interviews. We interview for the 05s, people straight out of residency or straight out of medical school, and then for our 5 and 2 fellowships, which are after residency. But I'm going to be focusing on the medical students. So for my disclosures, the irrelevant ones are medical, but my relevant ones for this talk are I have never done an official virtual resident interview, so nothing I tell you today has been tested, and I would not presume it to be correct. It's just my thoughts. So when we look at our traditional interview day, we generally will have an all-day experience for the applicants. About 14 to 16 applicants will be invited. We do 2 days of that. It starts the night before with a nice dinner, where they chat up the attendings and then spend some time with the residents. We feed them, we give them alcohol, and then at 7 a.m. we meet them at the hospital the next morning for a 30 to 40 minute welcome presentation where I tell them the history of MGH and vascular surgery and just pontificate for a while. And then we send them on 5 interviews with attendings. They meet residents to do tours of the hospital. They sit with the residents and talk with them. There's a lot of FaceTime with the residents. And then, as Dr. Dua said, we do have lunch with the residents and the attendings as a way to have a social interaction as well. But if we do a virtual interview day, I don't think it's going to be a day. It's really more of an experience. And when I look at my problems, how do we recreate a meaningful experience when you really don't have social interaction with the residents anymore? The participants can't see the attendings and residents interact. I think that's actually probably one of the biggest things that you see when you visit is just the way that the attendings and residents interact when nobody's paying attention. You don't get to view the history of the hospital, the culture, and get to walk through it. You don't see the benefits of the city. And you also don't get that overall feel of the program. I remember when I was interviewing, there were some programs that I walked out of and said, nope, never going to go there. And there are others where I thought, wow, this is a place that I could really thrive. And I think it's going to be very hard to recreate that in a virtual environment. Also, how do we get to know the candidates? You know, we use the resident input, the collective interview, and then the social interaction of the candidates with our secretaries and admins, and everybody has an input. And so when the candidate doesn't know anybody's paying attention, if they're mean to our admins, they're not coming, and we won't be able to have that because they're going to be on their best behavior as they come through. And as you do the collective interview, it's very easy after 16 applicants to say, these are the ones we like, these are the ones we're not sure about, and these are the ones that probably shouldn't come here. If you're doing smaller interviews, I think it's going to be harder to compare people on that scale. And I think the medical student buy-in is a really big thing. Traditionally, we only have a limited number of spots. There's a cost for travel, and it's almost like the resident's making, or the medical student is making a down payment on your program because they're going to put money towards the flight and their the hotel room, and then they have to take time off. If there are 2 interviews at 2 different places, they have to choose one. And so in that way, they are investing their time and their money into you. And so you already know that the people that are showing up are actually interested. In a virtual world, they're just limited by internet access alone, which everybody has, so they can interview everywhere. And some specialties that make sense, but in a place where there's 75 programs, it's really going to be hard to know who is truly interested in your program and who is just and who's not. And so I don't know if we're going to be able to have that traditional number where you say, boy, I need to match one person and I can interview 15. That may not be enough because your 15 people that you interview may not even be interested in you and you won't know it. So I'm calling this the Deconstructed Interview Day because it's just not going to be the way that we've done it in the past. And I think that's because the full day of Zoom is brutal. We've all had this Zoom fatigue where you're on these conferences all day. We just got done with the New England SVS, and I got to tell you, it was hard to sit there and listen to the talks, even if they're great. So you end up doing something else, seeing some patients, that kind of thing, and you're really in and out. And so I don't think that a full Zoom interview where you talk to 16 candidates in a single day is going to work. So I think we're going to have to do smaller groups of candidates. We have to limit the interview process for them. It won't be able to be a 24-hour immersion process. And then you're going to have to spread out the experience. And so that's going to be, I think, one of our biggest challenges is how do we do that? And then you're going to have free interaction with the candidates. I think it's not going to be good enough to just meet them over that 24-hour period and then a couple of emails. I think we're going to have to really do a lot more to be able to sell our programs to them. So we're going to replace the multi-hour interview day with what I'm calling multiple days instead of having the big marathon. And as I look at it, I think you have to limit your formal interview time to 2 to 3 hours. And we'll invite probably 4 candidates maximum at a time. And the way that I'll break it down is we'll start with an abbreviated welcome talk, maybe about 10 minutes. We'll skip the history, that type of thing. We'll probably send information to the candidates ahead of time so that they'll have more the nuts and bolts of the program before they're even coming in. And then my plan is to go to breakout rooms. We were going to do probably four rooms of attendings, where there's 2 in each room. And then we wanted to do a question and answer with residents. But if you've ever been in a large group on Zoom, it's very hard for one person to get their point across or for anyone to actually ask questions. We were just in a residency fair and we had 2 attendings and 2 residents from our side. And we would have 4 to 5 people at a time in there. And it was very difficult to give time to each person. You'd be talking to somebody, another person would pop up. And so you end up, cutting them off and to try to introduce yourself to the next person. And it was just very awkward. And so I think actually putting the residents into their own rooms is going to be the way to do this, so that it's going to be the candidate with 2 or 3 residents, maybe senior residents, then junior residents, and maybe the research residents, so that they have different ways to do this, as opposed to having, our 16 residents in a Zoom conference sort of staring at these other 4 people. I did go on the AAMC website. They have a couple of tips for scripting the interview. They talk about really acknowledging the unusual circumstances. As surgeons, we want to just kind of pretend that's not there. We're just going to get rid of the elephant in the room. But I think it makes sense to say, yeah, we know this is different. We know this is new. I think setting expectations is an important thing as well. And you can do that by giving them an itinerary ahead of time so they know exactly what to expect. And I think it's very important to not repeat questions. When we would do interviews with 16 people, a lot of the attendings would be looking at the chart for the first time, or looking at the patient's information for the first time, and maybe you end up asking the same questions. And I think with 4 people at a time, you can really get to know the ins and outs of them. And maybe one group asks about their research and one asks about something else. And so you try not to double up on these questions, so you get the most use of your time. And I think that allows you to give each group a purpose. And I think it's important to try to keep your interviewing pairs the same. The worst thing that can happen is you have one day where 4 people are interviewing and the next day they're different. And so there's no way to actually compare the candidates from interview day to interview day. Some other thoughts. This process is unknown to the candidates, but it also determines their future. So there's got to be a lot of worry on their side. When we were in this resident forum, I was in a T-shirt. My associate program director was in a T-shirt with his son on his lap, and everybody else came in a formal interview suit. And you realize, oh yeah, this is really important to them. And so I think need to keep this formal when we're doing it. I mean, as I sit without a tie, but I think you should be dressed up. I guess pants are optional, but you certainly need to have a tie, and it should look like you're taking this as seriously as they are. We need to limit distractions. It's so easy to have your dog or your cat around or your kids fighting in the background, and we really need to make sure that doesn't happen. I think you need to cluster the interviews. One of the ideas is that, oh, it's Zoom, we can do it anytime. But if you have people coming in, they've got an interview on Monday, then one on Tuesday, and then one on Wednesday, your interviewers are going to forget, and you don't want that. So you really want them to have a clustered interview at one time where they meet everybody and they're done, and then make the candidate the center of attention. For the extended interview process, and I'm running out of time here, so I'll go fast because I think other people are going to talk about this, but you got to find ways to interact with the candidates. Looking at resident and Zoom chats may work, case conferences, social media. Avoid the long lectures, and then limit the number of candidates that are there each time so that you can really spend a lot of time with them. I think this is most important. URAS, in their brilliance, decided that they were going to delay the time before we can actually see the applicants, and I feel like that's terrible because this is the time when we really need to spread this out. And so we won't actually get to see anything about our applications until October 21st. And so it's going to be a short interview season, and we're going to have to basically lengthen it while we're doing it. So I think that's going to be a big challenge. And then finally, create a formal scoring system, discuss and rate your candidates, and get input from everyone. So I will escape here.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. That was excellent. We do have a question for you in the chat, specifically directed at you by Dr. Chang. If you'd like to answer that question, asking how many faculty and residents are sufficient to get a representative sample of evaluators when interviewing candidates? And is there a smaller faculty group? If there is a smaller faculty group, should all faculty and residents participate and meet all the candidates, even if they could? Would you mind typing an answer to that so the rest of our group also could see your answer to that question? And next up, we have Dr. Simons, who's going to be talking about recruiting during this pandemic. Dr. Simons, as I mentioned, is an associate professor of surgery. She's the program director of the Integrated Vascular Residency at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And I'm going to now stop talking and
Great, thank you very much. So just like Dr. Conrad, I'm going to give you all of my pearls of wisdom for something that I've never done before right now. So recruitment efforts during the pandemic.
Dr. Simons,
Sorry.
I think you muted. Yep.
Sorry, I'm muted. See, look how good I am at it. So these are our goals and objectives. I want to review some common options for virtual recruitment and delineate the specific resources that programs may need to make use of these options, and then provide some guidance on how to choose a strategy for you. So as we all know, the pre-COVID state kind of had two opportunities to focus on recruiting applicants to your program. So opportunity number one relied heavily on word of mouth and program reputation. So essentially students get recommendations from their mentors and they choose sub-internships or acting internships where that's really their primary opportunity to go out and see how a program really functions. And then also sort of on a year-to-year basis, the people who did sub-Is at one institution will tell the next generation of med students how that sub-I was. And that's really how sort of a reputation of a program is built. Applicants typically apply very broadly and then accept interviews as they can fit into their schedules. And then our second opportunity is as we've talked about, occurs at the interview day, plus or minus a social event with the residents the evening beforehand. So to look at this in a slightly different fashion, there's sort of phases of the application season in the pre-COVID era, where you had this sort of June to end of September period of doing sub-Is, and then this mid-September to mid-November application submission session and scheduling of interviews. And then the very taxing traveling for interviews between December and sort of February-ish. Then rank lists, of course, go in, and match day is in mid-March. So again, just to highlight, there's two opportunities for people to really focus on the vast majority of their recruitment efforts in the pre-COVID era. So, but now, in the era of a pandemic, most institutions are not allowing visiting student rotations, and most students are discouraged from traveling out of state anyway. And the AAMC strongly discouraged in-person interviews, which has been endorsed by a number of other organizations, including the Association for Program Directors in Vascular Surgery. So we're basically talking about none of these opportunities really being available to us in the intra-COVID state, we'll say. So we have to rethink our recruitment strategies. Some institutions were really amazing and were able to get up and running, offering virtual sub-Is right away. Program websites were updated or overhauled, videos were added in. And then many programs chose to join social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, et cetera, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And there have been a number of virtual events, including so-called virtual residency fairs that were performed at the national level, and meet and greets that were performed by individual programs. So what does a program need in terms of resources? You know, what do you ask your head of GME for in order to pull all of this off? So first and foremost, you need a video conferencing program. Of course, Zoom is the one that's most common right now, I think, but there are many that exist that will suffice. If you are going to get one of these accounts, I think it's really incumbent upon your institution to make sure that you get access to a professional account with password protection options. And then you also need resources for establishing and branding your social media presence. So UMass, I have to give tons of credit to. They have an Office of Communications as well as an Office of Marketing and their IT department, who are all focused on providing resources well before the pandemic to help make sure that people were able to get up and running on things like Twitter and Instagram in a way that was compliant with HIPAA and other institutional guidelines. So how do you decide what you're going to do for your program? So I think the first and most important thing I thought about was I really needed to choose what the identity of my program is, determine exactly what I wanted to highlight, and then from there try to figure out how to best highlight that. Again, you have to be very mindful of what rules your institution may have. You want to, of course, be respectful of HIPAA, et cetera. And then you have to also figure out what resources will your institution provide. So like all things in life, I think, you know, you have to figure out kind of the best thing that you can possibly have, and then kind of scale back depending on what's actually possible. So do you have funding? Do you have a video production opportunity at your institution? Is there tech help, et cetera? And then if you don't have what you want, you ask for it, and maybe you get told yes, maybe you get told no. And then really, again, very important, it's good to think big, but then at the end of the day, how many warm bodies do you have to help you pull all of this off depending on your program size? So my particular approach personally, I thought about how candidates really make their decisions. Then I went out on a limb and I asked actual young people what social media might be most useful. And I assessed how much time I thought I could or couldn't put in to protect efforts to do these sorts of things. And as people have already kind of alluded to, I tried really hard to find the silver lining in all this because we can't change it. So you just gotta, you have to, what is it they say? If you don't adapt, you will just go extinct. So in terms of how candidates decide, question one, I think really these days, unlike my generation, the applicants these days are picking according to location and culture of the program. So how do you want to best showcase each of these things? Sorry, my cat is super annoying. So just like we talked about, Dr. Conrad, my cat's driving me crazy. So how do we best showcase our location? I felt like this could really be done. Of course, coming from central Massachusetts, we don't have, there's not a huge tourism industry here. We're not well known like, LA or Boston or New York City. So I thought sort of videos about the area sufficed and could be sort of put onto our website. There are links on our webpage. And then there's, of course, some social media posts that pertain to the area. Of course, we'll get some, good fall foliage posts up there to share with everybody to try to entice them to come to lovely Central Mass. And then the resident culture. I think this actually really is the strength of our program. And I wanted to try to find ways to really showcase this. So for that, I actually thought I would go the route of virtual meet and greets. Which Dr. Conrad mentioned a little bit about, as well as delve into the world of social media posts. So social media, full disclosure, I know very, very, very little about social media, but this has kind of forced me again to adapt so that I don't go extinct. So in the pre-pandemic era, we actually, others in my division were wonderful and were very proactive about creating a UMass Vascular Twitter feed. And that is maintained pretty actively, actually by our division chief now. By default, he managed to get put into that role, but he does a wonderful job with it. But more recently, in the era of this pandemic, the residents actually approached me from my program and said, we need an Instagram account and we need to run it. And I think, what I have kind of noticed trying to now catch up with each of these two social media platforms is that they're complementary to one another, particularly given who is running the different accounts. So of course, the one run by my division chief is very formal, lots of great information, but definitely sounds like it's coming from a division chief. Whereas our Twitter account, sometimes to my dismay, sounds definitely a bit more youthful, we'll say, and consistent with things that my residents want everyone to know about our program. So they're complementary. Time commitment. We're still very busy surgeons, of course. We are not all very well versed in tech. So I really think it's important to kind of look at who you have around you. What can your program coordinator do? What can other faculty do and your residents do, as I just indicated? And if you want to, of course, ask if there are people in marketing or IT that can help you manage your website content, et cetera. And as much as I have had a hard time with this, embracing the technology does offer some really unique opportunities for efficiency. Things like scheduling apps have actually saved me a ton of time in all of this, so that's been great to put in the effort to learn about them. And then finally, I think it's really been hard. A lot of us are not used to accepting that you may not be able to do it all, but you do in fact have to accept that you may not be able to do it all. So my strategy, again, I thought that the residency culture is kind of the strength of my program, and that's really kind of what I wanted to focus my efforts on. So our resident-run Instagram account, it's a little bit terrifying, but again, I'm very fortunate. I have a very small residency, and I know my residents very well, and so I trust them very much to make sure that they're going to represent us in a way that I can live with. I just kind of follow along just to, every now and then remind them that, you might want to black out that little name in the, little things. I've invited the residents to join me at each of these things that I've done. So the National Residency Fair that occurred recently, again, I was essentially just the moderator and let them kind of showcase their culture and the way that they interact with one another and share their thoughts about the program. And I organized and hosted some Zoom meet and greets, as we'll talk a little bit more about. So the UMass Vascular Open House. So this was 3 one-hour sessions that I set up on Zoom. It was 2 weekday evenings and 1 midday Saturday. I scheduled each hour into 20-minute time slots with a max of 5 applicants per time slot. So that essentially led in 3 hours to having 45 available time slots that were accessible to all different time zones, whether you were working long hours or not working long hours, et cetera. And what I thought was really brilliant actually was using one of these scheduling apps, this Calendly program, to make it so that the applicants themselves just self-scheduled. I set it up and they did all the rest, and I had to very little to do with it from an administrative side. And then I asked the residents, I begged the residents, but they were actually wonderful about it, to please try to participate in at least one session. And, encourage them, of course, they can divide themselves up so that not one person has to do all 3. But I wanted to have sort of a different a range of residents that were on each of these open houses to answer a range of different questions that may come up from the audience. And essentially, I functioned just as a moderator, allowing them the opportunity to speak about the program. So what's next? Well, I've done these 3 things and I feel pretty great about it, but I need a video, hopefully. The professional quote I was giving was $9,000, so we don't have that kind of money. I'd like to think about ways to live stream a case if I can find a patient that's willing, and a way to do it that's completely HIPAA compliant and patient sensitive. And then I need to solidify, test, and troubleshoot my plan for virtual interviewing, how many sessions, how long, et cetera. And most importantly, I need to stay engaged with a process that is admittedly a bit challenging. So I promised that I would think about a silver lining. So I'm almost out of time, but again, we've already talked a little bit about the huge benefits to the applicants themselves in terms of saving money and being able to go to more interviews. There's an extended season for the application, which I think is great. Sort of, but it is what it is, whether I like it or not. So I think what's nice is to look at as maybe we'll get higher quality applications because people have had a little bit more time to put into it. And then finally, of course, the role of sub-Is has been limited, but overall, it's extended the period of time in which we can try to get to know the applicants a little bit in a more meaningful way. So it's sort of a forced reflection on what the program identity is, which I think is always a useful thing to do every now and then. It will facilitate smaller and more frequent contacts between the applicants, residents, and faculty, and this has the potential for more meaningful, intentional efforts to select a true match, which of course is the goal. So in summary, we need institutional support for all kinds of tech needs. We need funds for videos. We need guidance for social media. We need branding and style guides, access to logos. We need trust from our institutions to let us kind of go out on a limb with these things, knowing that we will use our best judgment in the interest of our patients. And I would argue that we actually need some salary support too for the program directors who are tackling all this additional work. And we need help from our residents who are much closer to this generation. So, I think we have to find the silver lining in having a longer recruiting season. Hopefully it will make for a more perfect match in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simons. That was a fantastic talk. I'll just throw this out there. I'm working on something at Mass General currently that also needs AV. So just for the group, one of the things that I did not know was that we have our own AV department. Of course, different institutions have different things, but the professional quote that I was given was also around 10,000, but the Mass General AV quote was 2,000 a day. So it's possible at your own institution, if you just dial the IT line, that there might be somebody who can do it for you. So just a little thing to throw out there. And I'm going to turn over everything now to Dr. Warner, who's my co-moderator on this session, to introduce our final two wonderful panelists.
Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne Warner. I'm a surgical oncologist and hepatobiliary surgeon at City of Hope in the Los Angeles, California area. I'm the co-chair of the Committee on Academic Advancement here with Association for Academic Surgery. And I'm here on behalf of my chair, Don Coleman of the committee, Dr. Don Coleman. I'm super excited to introduce to you Dr. Tanya Arora, who is she is an associate professor of surgery and surgical oncology and the program director for the general surgery residency at the Medical College of Georgia. We are thrilled to have her here to talk to us about how to interview virtually for equity and diversity. And I'll turn the floor over to her without further ado. Thank you, Dr. Arora.
Thank you, Dr. Warner. So it's really a pleasure to talk tonight, and especially about virtual interviewing in the framework of equity and diversity. I think it's been on many of our minds to interview with that framework in mind, but now to translate it to the virtual platform is an even greater challenge. So I have no disclosures. When I looked at this process, and I really started looking at it last year for the first time with any real strategy, this was a period of reflection for myself and for our program. And I would say the same principles apply to most programs. You want to start with just looking at where you are. What population of patients you serve? What does your faculty and resident complement look like? And what are the needs of your program? So where do you see yourself going? Where do you want to be? Who do you want to represent? And that will really sort of guide the process in terms of finding out what steps you really need to take. When we started last year, we really wanted to do something that was deliberate. Like anything with diversity and inclusion, you want to be have a meaningful metric. We didn't want to do too much at once because, like anything with change, it can be challenging. It is always not easy. There's sometimes very resource intensive. So you want to be mindful of those challenges before you embark on taking too many steps at once. Our first phase was in structured interviews. And so I'm going to talk in a little more detail about how to do that and how to adapt that to the virtual realm a little bit later. The AAMC has been using this phrase since the early 2000s of holistic review. And so what it means now is really even more important now with our shift from USMLE scores in a couple of years to looking at what we think is important in our applicants. Like all the former speakers have emphasized, you want to decide on your tech for this virtual space and you want to practice. There are too many variables. For us, it was also about low-hanging fruit. Where could we make the most meaningful change? So we wanted to focus on our phases of this recruitment cycle about content and delivery. I'm going to put my references and my resources at the beginning because, again, they were really pivotal for me a year ago. They still are now in restructuring our recruitment cycle. So these are all, many of them from the AAMC, and they are really impactful in training your faculty in how to recognize implicit bias. They're also, they were really important for me in learning what a structured or standardized interview meant and how I could recreate my own. A couple of the articles that are mentioned are really very good frameworks and pathways for any program who is looking at making change. So this is one of the articles, one of the tables from one of the articles from Dr. Amy Gardner. This was from a couple of years ago, and it's really stuck with me. It's been sort of my path in making change and looking at what steps we would tackle next. So incorporating screening tools that level the playing field for all groups. This is key. These are what we'll highlight later, which are the ERAS filters, which are how you gauge the score metrics that are still visible on applications. Reconsider the role of personal statements and letters, and the next speaker is going to talk about that in more detail, so I won't touch on that. Become familiar with how your program is making initial screening decisions. If you're listening to this webinar and you're not the one making the decision, learn how the department is making the decision, because it's really critical that those first initial screening steps are made in the right way. Selecting an inclusive interviewing team, and then incorporating standardized interviews. So, like most programs, we're in the planning stages. We're making the laundry list of all the things that we think are going to be necessary in this phase. Like other programs, we also did an open house in early August and really tried to do a month of marketing prior to that open house. So started marketing in July for that open house, knowing that we wanted to sort of see what the field of applicants was like, and if we were going to do something, try to do it the best we could. When you think about planning for this pre-interview stage, you want to think about, how am I going to, if I'm going to do implicit bias training? Like a lot of modules or training exercises, is this going to give you the bang for your buck? And I'm going to argue, no, it's not. This is not really the road to changing behavior. It's good to tell your faculty to recognize implicit bias. It's good to remind them of the things not to do during the interview, where your NRMP match violations might show up. But I think the bang for your buck is really in the other things that I'll highlight, which is your structured interview. Your structured interview is really going to mitigate some of the bias of your interviewers, and the filters. So those filters, we actually, even this week in our program, started looking at how and which filters we might choose. And the question we kept asking ourselves is, if we choose this filter, which applicant are we going to exclude, and is it worth it? And that's really how you make those critical decisions about your real screening process. It's probably going to be more labor intensive for us this year, but that's where we see the payoff. So choosing the right interview team, selecting those key events that allow interaction with your residents. We had residents present at our open house. We're also planning for pre-interview activities that will have resident-only interaction. We've already touched on some of these other things that you can do, but highlighting the diversity in the tour that you show in your video, or in your asynchronous activities or material that you're going to send to your applicants, is a really a good way to feature what you take seriously. So you want to also plan for what the applicant challenges might be. And we know some applicants may not have all of the camera, the microphone, a quiet space to conduct the interview. And so you have to be mindful about giving them an opportunity, if needed, for a phone interview. It also may be that an asynchronous interview is the right thing for you or your program. And so considering having pre-selected questions that are given to the applicant to record and send back is that model that you could use. And you want to acknowledge and recognize the stress that not only the applicant is facing, but also your interviewer. So you want to budget in those breaks that are necessary for both the interviewer and the applicant. As I mentioned, you want to be very straightforward about match violations. These are the low-hanging fruit that you can really get out of the picture. Inform your faculty about what not to talk about. The mention of implicit and unconscious bias, again, remind them about, 1, it exists, 2, we all have it, and 3, here's how it could impact your scoring rubric. So when the AAMC talks about the mitigation of bias, it's really those 3 steps. They actually have a longer list than this, but I include these 3 because I think they're the simplest, easiest, and most translatable to all faculty. You want to remind them the most common error we make when we meet our applicants is that we're looking for those applicants that just remind us of ourselves. And so that's how the structured interview can help to avoid that bias. During the interview, the other challenge of the virtual space is always to establish rapport. So making sure your camera and the applicant's camera is always on seems like an obvious thing, but maintaining eye contact with the camera, lining up the picture of the applicant with the camera so you're actually looking one-on-one with the camera is important. Leaving room, that time for breaks, leaving room for those non-standardized questions or icebreakers that might be necessary to establish that rapport is important, and then really time for the applicant to also get in their questions. So why structured interviews are important. When I started this route of research, one of the studies I came across was from 2016, which said that most applicants from all specialties, 90% had encountered some type of discriminatory question. It made me reflect on my own general surgery residency interview trail, and I wanted to share some memorable questions. So this question was from a chair of a department who asked me if I would perform an abortion if a female patient needed this. As a 4th-year medical student, there was no clinical context. There was absolutely, I didn't realize or have any knowledge at that point that a general surgeon faced this dilemma, and there was a crucifix on the wall. I did not know how to address this. Frankly, I'm sure I bombed that interview. Another faculty member at a different institution said, you know, you grew up in Virginia and you did all your training in Virginia. You live near enough to home all your life. How are you going to leave mommy and daddy and join our program? You want to sound welcoming during the interview. Are you planning on doing research, and will you have children while you're in the lab? I didn't know this was a violation, okay? I was a 4th-year medical student, but I remembered that it made me feel awkward. My favorite question happened with another senior faculty member. What do you like to do outside your studies? This seemed like a completely innocent question and one that I could fairly answer. And I started listing off some outdoor activities and yoga. His response was, well, of course you do. Again, there was a little bit of awkwardness. So structured interviews, the pros of these structured and standardized interviews, they mitigate bias. They really do improve reliability and fairness when, not that every person in every room gets asked the same question, but the core values behind those questions are the same. It also allows us to gauge that applicant beyond the application. So how they communicate, how they might handle a difficult situation. And with everything, there are going to be cons. So the downside to this process is they're not necessarily as fun, right? We're not talking about all our common interests, and really they're not looked as most favored by the applicants themselves. So when I went to embark on this process, I, again, did a lot of online research, and I didn't realize there are commercially available resources. I know that now, but having done this process, I know it's doable. I looked again to other industry. I looked at their questions and how I could model and adapt them to the surgery world, and the principles are essentially the same. You identify the core values that you want to seek in your residents, how you want to find out if how they'll add value to your program, and you design those questions We ended up making 10 versions for our interviewers that year. Now, in the process of adapting to the second phase of this is really focused on, one, our selection process, and then two, our scoring rubric. So we're changing things in the framework of diversity and equity. I'd be happy to talk more about this in the break, but I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aurora. That was very enlightening and I think very helpful to everybody who might be looking for some more resources and structure, and certainly hit home for some of my memories on the interview trail as well. And I'm sure those of many watching and listening, regrettably. Next, our next presenter, we've got a few Q&A things coming in. We will defer those for the last moments of the session. We have some very good questions that I think all the panelists will be able to comment on. So I'll invite them to look at those and consider their answers while Dr. Martin is giving his talk. We're thrilled to have Dr. Colin Martin here. He is an associate professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He's a pediatric surgeon and the Associate Vice Chair of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion there. We are thrilled to have him talk about how to write an equitable letter of recommendation. He is also a member of the AAS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, as is Dr. Aurora, and we are thrilled as a society to continue critically considering these issues together. And Dr. Martin, we'll invite you to begin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and hello to everyone. I think I should be able to finish in time to have a robust question and answer session. Let me just move the faces away so I can see. Okay. So what makes a strong letter? And we'll go into this a little bit during the talk. Is it the length? Is it the writer? Is it hyperbole? Someone saying that this is the best resident or student I've ever seen? Given examples within that letter. Is it the large sample size? One second, having a little trouble advancing. But ultimately, what makes a strong letter is achieving the goal. This is a picture of two of our residents who recently matched into pediatric surgery. And so a strong letter is a letter that gets the people that you mentor, the people that you support into the next phase of their training and education. So what is an equitable letter? It's a fair letter, it's an impartial letter, a letter that advocates, a letter that achieves the goal. And so this has been a topic that's been discussed multiple times throughout this session, and it's a recurring theme, I think, for a reason. And this is our cartoon that sort of gets at implicit bias. And so all these things that are built into who we are, our experiences, our DNA, where we were brought up, they sort of affect our implicit bias, how we see the world, how we see other candidates. It can really affect how we write letters. So for the next 2 or 3 minutes, we'll just talk briefly about the literature, some anecdotal advice that I received, and some personal experiences. So there's quite a bit of literature on letters of recommendation. This is a recent paper from our institution titled "Do Male Chairs of Surgery Have Implicit Gender Bias in Residency Application Process?" So this was a study where at one institution at UAB, the authors looked at all of the letters of recommendation from residents going back about 15 years from department chairs. And what they found was that they did a qualitative analysis of the letters. What they found that comparing male to female letters, the female letters actually had a better quality score based on the terms that were used, which was very interesting. Also, they looked at the overall score between white and non-white applicants. And so the score for white applicants compared to some of the other groups, now granted some of the other groups were smaller, was higher for white compared to Black and Hispanic. And also looking at the Asian applicants, the letters are less likely to have discussions about the Asian applicant's personality. And so all these things are interesting facts, interesting details, and it gets into some of the implicit biases that letter writers may have. Another recent paper from the Journal of American College of Surgeons looks at the same issue and they looked at letters of recommendation for in one given year at one institution. And so this looked at the length of letters between male applicants and female applicants, which I thought was very interesting. So the letters that were written on behalf of male applicants tended to be longer than the letters for female applicants. And then looking at whether the letters written by male or female, there also were differences. I thought it was very striking that looking at female letter writers, the length of the letters for female letter writers was not different between male and female applicants, but it was different if a man was writing a letter, which gets at the implicit bias at gender in this space. They looked at topics like leadership, and so the letters written about men had the word leader or leadership significantly more compared to letters written about females. And then words like star, impressive, exceptional, excel, again, if the letter was written for a male applicant, these words are more likely to be seen compared to a female applicant. And so there's a lot of data on this, but I also thought to reach out to some of my colleagues around the country just to get their opinion. And so this is not a published study. These are just a few opinions. And so I made some phone calls and just asked a few people who I respect. And this is what they told me. When doing a letter of recommendation for anyone, I always ask what would they like me to highlight. If the applicant is underrepresented, I recognize there could be distance traveled that may have depreciated in traditional metrics. So distance traveled, for many of you know, is what it took for this applicant to get to this point. What do they have to overcome, whether it be financial hurdles, other things growing up. I can truthfully affirm personal attributes such as honesty, dependability, and hard work. I elevate these above traditional academic pedigree. In essence, I try to nudge whoever's reading to adopt a holistic review approach. Another friend said, honestly, some folks make assumptions about leadership and academic productivity for underrepresented applicants. I have found that reviewing the CV isn't very helpful. The letter needs to draw out important aspects of their leadership and contribute to science and contributions to science. It's also important to highlight awards that demonstrate an accomplishment above all of their peers. And finally, because I want the letter to be an accurate reflection of the individual, their achievements, and their potential as well, I minimize the impact of my potential implicit biases or of those of the reader. I tend to use a fairly formulatic approach to the letters. I will often use essentially the same letter for men and women during the same time period, only swapping out biographical details and other specifics in order to avoid unconsciously using stereotypical phrasing to describe the applicant. And so just a brief moment of reflection for my own journey. I've been an attending now I'm in my 9th year of practice, and I've probably written maybe 100, 150 letters for different applicants. And there's one applicant that I interacted with well, who had a different background, a different persuasion than I did, who was a very fine applicant in every way. And I was crafting his letter. I found myself trying to explain to the reader that this applicant may be different from the norm, but if you can just get past his difference, he's really excellent. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that the problem with that approach was really me. The own bias that I had was clouding my letter and clouding what I really thought about him. And so it gave me an opportunity to really step back and reflect about the biases that we all have, and how once you can recognize them, there are a lot of ways to mitigate them and to make the letters more equitable. So in conclusion and take home, the letter is not enough. As many of us know, going through competitive applicant matches, the letter comes, and then calls come, emails come. And I encourage all of us who are writing letters, who really feel strongly about an applicant, and we really want to push this applicant, make phone calls, email, use your social influence to really advocate for these applicants. And pediatric surgery and other specialties can be quite competitive. And so very often after the interview process is over, we get separate emails and separate phone calls, which really go a long way. And finally, minimize your biases, consider a form or standardized letter, and it takes time. It takes time to write these letters. You know, often we get asked to write a lot of letters, and it can be pretty overwhelming balancing our letter writing with our other clinical and academic responsibilities. But it's really hard to write an equitable letter in 10 or 15 minutes. Also, it takes time to get to know the applicant and the person that you're writing the letter for. Often that interaction that you need to say this person is great, to really get behind them, often that comes outside of the operating room. It comes interacting socially. And if you understand that your social circle, your social sphere is going to be often similar to you, then you miss out on those critical social interactions that you might have with underrepresented applicants. So it takes time to develop those relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. That was enlightening as well. I'm going to address one quick question that has come in while you were speaking, which was to Dr. Martin. Is a longer letter better? Some letter writers try to keep it short to keep the reader's attention span.
I think the longer, it depends on the content of the letter. If the long letter has great content, great anecdotal things, I think it's good to put in there. But if the long letter has a lot of fluff, a lot of superficial things, it can hurt a little bit.
Okay, thank you. One question that came in very early on that I want to make sure we address that is actually, I think, relevant to all of us as humans is how are the program directors staying engaged? This came in actually, I believe, during Dr. Simons's talk, so I'll pitch this to her. With the COVID and the ongoing fallout, a lot of people are feeling exhausted, and this may feel like one more mountain that we all need to climb to figure out how to do this right. How are you staying positive during this time?
I think I'm incredibly fortunate that the group of residents that I have currently are absolutely outstanding humans and really sort of inspiring. And so I feel sort of a personal obligation to not let them down and to make sure that we do everything we can to find people that will continue this tradition of fitting in really well with this group.
Thank you. Dr. Aurora, I'll address the next question to you from Dr. Amit Mathur at Mayo Clinic, Arizona, who asks, what do the panelists think are the best ways to pick up on the soft stuff? So the little things that you would normally pick up on the interview day outside of the formal one-on-ones. Dr. Aurora, after you answer, I'll pitch that to Dr. Conrad, because he had also mentioned some of that as part of the deconstructed interview day.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because I'm sure he has a better answer than me. It's a challenge. I don't think there's a really good answer to this. I think that we lose most of our nonverbal communication during the virtual interview with body language, but your face is amplified. So your expression and your communication and your smoothness, your ability to relax in a stressful situation are kind of soft stuff. They're going to come through. I think what's not going to come through is the interactive stuff, you know, the stuff we learned when they would come to the pre-interview cocktail hour, and we'd sort of see how they moved around the room, how they got along with the residents, and the resident feedback, I think, is key, which is why we are still doing as an institution the pre-interview meet and greets, because we know that one-on-one interaction is going to provide us useful feedback and maybe some of the soft stuff.
Dr. Conrad, your thoughts?
I think it's volume of interaction that's going to be important here, and so because not only do you want to see if they're going to fit, but you also are to figure out who's actually interested. And I think that's going to be the hardest thing for us as we go through this. And so that's going to mean that you're going to have resident meet and greets and case conferences, and just basically keep inviting them and seeing if they keep showing up. And I think the ones that are interested will continually interact with you, and the ones that are not will disappear. And so that's one way to do it. But I think you're going to need multiple social interactions on Zoom over and over. And so I think that's where this is going to be very difficult, because we're used to putting a very long 24-hour period in and then moving on with our lives. And I think that's not going to be what we're going to be seeing. I think you see a lot of PDs are going to be spending their evenings talking to potential candidates and running Zoom conferences with residents to try to figure out, who we want to rank and to get to know these applicants better and to let them get to know us.
So that's actually a really great segue to another question that Dr. Simons offered a very nice answer to in the answered box on the Q&A, but I'll pitch it to some of the other panelists as well. Drs. Martin, Conrad, and Aurora, the first person to unmute gets to speak. So this attendee, Dr. Mammon, asked, they've heard tell of applicants applying to over 100 general surgery programs. So Dr. Conrad, you just alluded to some of the ways that you feel like you can gather whether or not the applicants are serious. This questioner asked whether will screening include new items like proximity to predict likelihood of an applicant being truly interested, and then will you add additional interview days to accommodate more applicants because you may have a decreasing likelihood of people matching. So first person unmute. Dr. Conrad may still be unmuted from his last
Yeah,
comment.
I guess I never muted, so it's like I'm cheating. We are adding more interview days. I don't know if we'll interview more people, but because we're doing smaller groups, we'll definitely have more days. I don't use an ERAS whatever to figure these things out. We go through every application, and then basically what we're trying to figure out is this person going to be able to survive in our environment? Which means I have to interact with the general surgery residents who are incredibly strong and really bright, and they need to be considered one of them. And so I think that's my first process is I look through and say, do I think that they can make it here? And if I don't, then those are the people that I won't interview. But I think we'll have the option to interview more people because of the virtual interviews.
Dr. Aurora, any thoughts? You're unmuted as well.
Oh. I think that, I agree. We're doing a few more sessions in terms of the number of interviews. I think that I would echo what Dr. Conrad said.
Okay, great. In the waning minutes of the session, Dr. Julie Park has asked, could you please give some points on creating a standardized scoring system? Dr. Aurora, I believe you alluded to a rubric, and if others want to weigh in as well, what are some of the ways to weigh certain things over others in terms of the numbers of publications and letters of rec, et cetera? So I'll ask Dr. Aurora and then Dr. Martin to comment on that, and if the other two want to weigh in as well.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the activities we were working on this week. And so we still haven't finalized the actual scoring rubric that we're going to use, but part of the decision-making process is we translate the percent emphasis that we want to put on an attribute. And I think life experience is really an important attribute. So for the first time, we're including overcoming challenges and hurdles and that life experience into that scoring rubric. We're considering the obvious other parts of the application, but we're weighing them a little bit less. And I think that's going to be more meaningful. The other sort of filter process that has been described by Dr. Carrie Ahrens from Pennsylvania is that blinded selection process. So we're piloting that for our institution as well, which is part of tailoring your filters to give a wider net and a wider opportunity to the applicant pool, and then blinding yourself from gender, ethnicity score, and pedigree. And so giving everybody a shot based on the other attributes that you can find in the application.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that creating a scoring system is going to be different for different institutions and different specialties. And I think it's important to take into account the people that are interviewing. And if you happen to be at a place where there's not a lot of diversity on your faculty, perhaps having other people who represent those deficits in diversity to help create your scoring system, because there may be some blind spots that we all have if we don't have a diverse representation, but we're trying to attract diverse applicants.
Drs. Conrad or Simons, anything to add?
I don't think so.
All right, great. We have one more question. Dr. Scott Resnick from UT Southwestern has asked that many letters of recommendation sometimes seem interchangeable. how do we discriminate and sort of read between the lines as reviewers of letters of recommendation, who is good and who is bad? Dr. Martin, I might pitch that to you since that was your topic of presentation.
Yeah, I think there's limitations to letters of recommendation. You know, every applicant that we support, not only are they they're going to be our pedigree and coming from our institution, but our reputation's on the line. So we're going to put them in the most positive light. And so there's a tendency there for some hyperbole about the letters. I think the letters are good for looking for red flags. There will be some red flags that will be in letters that may not come out in the CV or the application that you can pull out. But also if the letter seems interchangeable, sometimes making a phone call, you know, a lot of what letter writers may put on paper, they would be more honest and frank in a phone conversation that's not recorded, where you can get more information.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that we've already gone 5 minutes over the time that you were so kind to give us, all four of you, and also Dr. Dua and JJ and Nicole, and everybody who attended. Thank you so much. I'll kick it to Dr. Dua to finish us out and just say it's an honor to be part of an organization that so thoughtfully considers every part of supporting its membership. So thank you guys for doing your part for AAS tonight, and thank you to everybody watching. Dr. Dua?
I just want to echo those thoughts as well, especially for our panelists. I mean, you obviously are the heart of this. Without your volunteerism truly here and your discussion about your topics and putting things out there, especially since, as you all mentioned, this is the first time we're all doing this. We really appreciate it. We've had a fantastic turnout, excellent discussion. And if there are any more comments from the audience, or if the panelists want us to kick back to any of the audience to get anything back, we can just communicate through Nicole, myself, and Susan, and we can go from there and hopefully see you all at the next session that AAS will be hosting. Thank you again.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye.